Royal Enfield just turned history into a liability. They brought back the Flying Flea, a name tied to function, not fashion, earned through real-world use, not marketing. That name carried expectations. But once the bikes hit the ground, experienced riders noticed a gap between the story being told and the machine being delivered. Across different dealers and shipments, the same build inconsistencies started showing up. And riders who've been around long enough know patterns are where the truth lives. That's when confidence didn't collapse. It thinned. Stay with me till the end, because I'll break down how this crossed a line, why riders spotted it early, and what it means before you decide to buy, wait, or walk away. The name that carried weight. Long before press releases and unveilings, the name Flying Flea carried its own gravity among riders. It was never about novelty or fashion. It was about function earned under pressure when motorcycles were expected to work, not impress. The original Flying Flea became known as a tool that solved real problems in difficult conditions. And that reputation settled into rider memory over decades. It represented lightness, simplicity, and usefulness, qualities that mattered long before marketing departments learned how to borrow them. Among riders, names like this do not need explanation. They travel through stories, garages, and handed-down conversations. The Flying Flea name lived in that space. Understood without instruction, respected without decoration. It was tied to a time when motorcycles were judged by whether they could be trusted, fixed, and relied upon, not by how they photographed or what they symbolized on a poster. That history created weight. Not hype, not excitement, but expectation. When a manufacturer reaches back to a name like Flying Flea, it does not start from zero. It inherits memory, standards, and assumptions that already exist. That inheritance is neutral but powerful. It does not praise or condemn on its own. It simply exists, waiting to be honored or mishandled. It sat quietly in the background, shaping expectations without needing to announce itself, publicly or loudly. That weight is exactly why the rollout mattered so much. How the promise was framed. The rollout of the Flying Flea leaned heavily on imagery and implication. Words like heritage, revival, and legacy did most of the work before anything tangible entered the conversation. Visuals referenced earlier eras, familiar shapes, and carefully chosen cues meant to trigger recognition. None of this was unusual. It was familiar territory for a brand that understood how deeply its history resonated. What mattered was how thoroughly the promise was framed before reality arrived. The language suggested continuity rather than experimentation. The presentation implied that the name itself guaranteed alignment with past values. By the time the story reached riders, expectations were already formed. Trust had been invited in early without conditions, simply through association and tone. This approach created a quiet contract, not written, not spoken outright, but understood. When a name carries weight, presentation becomes a commitment. The rollout did not focus on limits or trade-offs. It focused on atmosphere, emotion, and belonging. That framing shaped how everything that followed would be interpreted, for better or worse. It relied on familiarity to do the heavy lifting, assuming recognition would bridge any unanswered questions. That strategy can work when substance follows quickly. Here, the emphasis remained on suggestion, leaving space for assumption to grow unchecked, filling gaps with confidence that had not yet been earned before expectations hardened into quiet certainty among riders. The problem started once the talking stopped. If this breakdown is lining up with what you've been noticing, tap like so more riders see it. Subscribe for deeper reporting that respects. Experience, share your perspective below, because real-world ownership stories are how truth cuts through marketing noise. First contact changed the tone. First contact rarely produces outrage. It produces pause. Early encounters with the Flying Flea created that pause among experienced riders who knew what to listen for and what to ignore. The reaction was not loud, it was measured. Something felt slightly out of step. Not broken, not offensive, just misaligned with what had been implied. Those early impressions surfaced in quiet conversations and cautious language. Words like interesting, curious, and different appeared more often than praise. There was an absence of certainty. Riders took time before forming opinions, a familiar behavior when something does not immediately settle into known categories. Hesitation filled the space where confidence usually sits. What stood out was not a single flaw, but an overall feeling that the story and the reality were not moving at the same speed. Expectations set earlier met something that required more thought than expected. That gap registered instinctively among people used to trusting their first impressions. It was the kind of moment that prompts extra questions instead of answers. No one rushed to conclusions. The mood leaned cautious, reflective, and observant. When riders slow down mentally, it usually signals that something deserves closer attention, not dismissal. Those signals tend to appear only when experience clashes with expectation, and instincts start double-checking the narrative before comfort has time to settle in fully for anyone. That hesitation didn't stay quiet for long. Gear and accessories I use are listed in the description if you want to check them out. Back to the Flying Flea. Why this crossed a line. At a certain point, the issue stopped being about expectation. It became about trust. Within the riding community, trust forms slowly and breaks quickly. It is built through consistency and respect, not through promises. When that trust fractures, it feels personal because it rests on shared standards rather than individual taste. This moment marked that shift. The conversation moved away from curiosity and towards something heavier. Riders began separating disappointment from something more serious. Disappointment fades. Trust does not. The difference matters because it changes how claims are received, regardless of intention. What crossed the line was not a single moment or detail. It was the realization that the relationship itself had been strained. Once that understanding settles in, everything that follows is measured differently. Words are weighed. Claims are questioned. The benefit of the doubt becomes smaller. This distinction explains why reactions sharpened without becoming hysterical. There was restraint, but also resolve. People recognized that something fundamental had shifted, and that recognition carried weight. Trust, once unsettled, reshapes every interaction that follows. It changes patience, tolerance, and willingness to believe. That change does not announce itself loudly, it simply stays. For riders, that kind of shift lingers, influencing decisions long after the initial moment passes. It alters how stories are heard and how promises are evaluated by people who notice patterns over time. Once trust cracks, details start to matter. Where the build fell short. Build issues around the Flying Flea did not surface as isolated complaints or rare defects. Reports moving through service channels showed repetition rather than randomness. The same concerns appeared across different locations, different shipments, and different inspection stages. That repetition matters because patterns indicate process failure rather than user error or chance variation. Consistency became the first signal. Components expected to match showed visible variance. Finishes meant to align did not. Assembly points that normally follow tight tolerance displayed uneven outcomes. None of this required interpretation or opinion. It was visible, measurable, and repeatable. When consistency slips, it signals that upstream controls are not holding. Inspection records reinforced the picture. Items cleared in one batch raised flags in another. Adjustments corrected some examples while leaving others unchanged. That uneven outcome pointed away from isolated mistakes and toward systemic gaps. Structural problems do not announce themselves loudly. They reveal themselves through repetition. Viewed clinically, the issue was not severity, but reliability. A system can tolerate small flaws if they occur rarely. It cannot tolerate moderate flaws that appear frequently. That distinction defines whether a problem remains manageable or becomes embedded. The accumulated evidence pointed consistently toward systemic weakness, rather than random deviation across production stages and quality control checkpoints that failed to align over time repeatedly. Overall, build quality is only half the story. Confidence didn't follow the machine. Real-world use exposed a different layer of failure. Trust is built through predictability, not novelty. Riders judge machines by whether behavior remains consistent across conditions, time, and routine use. In this case, confidence did not follow the machine naturally or easily. Usability became the focus. Controls, responses, and feedback did not settle into a familiar rhythm. Nothing dramatic occurred. Instead, uncertainty lingered. Small inconsistencies accumulated, making outcomes harder to anticipate. Predictability matters because it allows riders to relax into the experience. Without it, attention stays fixed on the machine rather than the road. Trust depends on repetition without surprise. When actions produce expected results, confidence grows quietly. When outcomes vary without explanation, doubt takes root. Here, doubt appeared early. It was not driven by failure, but by inconsistency. That distinction matters, because inconsistency erodes confidence faster than outright malfunction. The machine did not invite reliance. It required constant awareness. That requirement kept trust from forming organically. Confidence is not forced. It emerges when behavior aligns with expectation over time. In this case, alignment remained elusive. Predictability governs confidence more than novelty. When responses vary without explanation, attention remains fixed on the machine. Trust forms only after repeated, consistent outcomes remove surprise. Absent that pattern, reliance stalls, regardless of intent, expectation, or prior reputation over time. This gap between use and trust shaped perception moving forward. Once predictability falters, every interaction is re-evaluated. Even neutral outcomes are questioned. That shift changes how machines are judged, independent of intent or design. Confidence did not follow, and that absence became difficult to ignore. And that uncertainty landed somewhere specific. Dealers absorbed the impact. Operational pressure concentrated at the dealership level. Communication gaps left dealers fielding questions without clear guidance. Information arrived late or incomplete, forcing frontline staff to interpret situations without support. That placed dealers between expectation and reality. Absorbing friction meant for higher levels. Dealers became the buffer. They handled concerns, managed uncertainty, and maintained relationships without definitive answers. This role shift increased strain. Inventory decisions, scheduling, and customer conversations all carried added complexity. Without consistent messaging, operations became reactive rather than planned. The issue was logistical, not emotional. Dealers rely on clarity to function efficiently. When clarity disappears, time is spent managing ambiguity instead of serving customers. That inefficiency compounds quickly. Staff are left balancing caution with commitment, unsure which direction aligns with future guidance. Operational exposure also affects confidence internally. When dealers cannot rely on predictable communication, planning becomes conservative. Risk tolerance shrinks. That shift affects ordering, promotion, and long-term strategy at the ground level. Operational strain concentrates where clarity is missing. Dealers manage uncertainty through improvisation, absorbing friction created elsewhere. Without consistent guidance, planning contracts, risk tolerance drops, and efficiency suffers. These effects accumulate quietly, reshaping day-to-day operations before leadership notices the problem fully. This dynamic placed disproportionate responsibility on retail operations. Dealers did not create the conditions, but they managed the consequences daily. Over time, that imbalance weakened the protective layer that history once provided. At that point, history stopped offering protection. Heritage couldn't cover the gap. Previous revivals, succeeded because execution matched implication. History functioned as reinforcement, not replacement. In those cases, legacy supported substance already present. With the Flying Flea, that balance shifted. Heritage was asked to compensate for gaps it could not address. The formula broke when continuity failed. Earlier successes aligned name, expectation, and delivery. Here, alignment faltered. Legacy alone could not bridge the distance between promise and outcome. Once that realization set in, history lost its insulating effect. Comparisons to past revivals highlighted the difference. When substance leads, heritage amplifies. When substance lags, heritage exposes the gap more clearly. The Flying Flea demonstrated the latter. Legacy magnified scrutiny rather than softening it. Legacy supports execution only when alignment exists. When outcomes lag implications, history amplifies scrutiny instead of cushioning impact. Past success raises expectations, narrowing tolerance for variance. In such cases, heritage highlights gaps, accelerating reassessment rather than deferring judgment by observers. This marked the end of the factual phase. Patterns had been identified, processes examined, outcomes observed. Heritage no longer reframed those findings. It simply stood beside them, unchanged. At that point, the story moved beyond the model itself. The groundwork had been laid. The effects did not stay contained. Loyalty began to shift. Loyalty rarely disappears all at once. It thins. Among longtime riders, the response to the Flying Flea was not outrage, but internal recalibration. People who had trusted the brand for years did not suddenly reverse course. Instead, they paused. Confidence that once felt automatic required conscious justification. That change mattered more than loud criticism ever could. Doubt entered quietly. Riders revisited assumptions they had not questioned before. Past experiences were weighed against present signals. This process unfolded privately, in thought and conversation, rather than in declarations. Loyalty became conditional rather than assumed. That shift altered how information was received going forward. Trust thinning looks different from trust breaking. There was no collective rejection. There was hesitation. Riders became slower to defend, slower to recommend, slower to assume alignment. That restraint signaled recalibration rather than rebellion. It suggested that confidence was no longer self-sustaining. Re-evaluation unfolded privately, shaped by experience rather than reaction. Long-standing assumptions were reviewed against new signals, producing conditional trust. This recalibration reduced advocacy without prompting rejection, signaling maturity in judgment and a preference for verification before renewed commitment over time. Once loyalty enters review, it changes permanently. Even if confidence returns later, it does so differently. The unquestioned becomes measured. The familiar becomes conditional. That change does not require anger, it requires awareness. And awareness had spread. Others noticed the opening. Competitors stayed disciplined. Rival manufacturers responded not with reaction, but restraint. While attention focused elsewhere, competitors avoided rushing into similar territory. Decisions emphasized caution over speed. Where opportunity appeared, discipline held. That contrast mattered. Restraint showed itself through what did not happen. No sudden revivals, no hurried announcements, no attempts to capitalize directly on the moment. Instead, competitors maintained their trajectories, reinforcing continuity rather than chasing headlines. That steadiness reinforced confidence. The difference lay in pacing. Where one path accelerated toward symbolism, others slowed to protect alignment. Discipline kept expectations and execution synchronized. That approach does not attract immediate attention, but it prevents misalignment from forming in the first place. Restraint protected competitors from inheriting unnecessary risk. By declining speed, they preserved coherence between promise and delivery. Discipline reduced exposure, allowing observation to inform timing. Sometimes inaction communicates stability more effectively than bold moves or rapid announcements to stakeholders broadly. By choosing not to rush, competitors avoided inheriting unnecessary risk. They allowed the moment to clarify rather than dictate action. That patience preserved trust. It demonstrated that not every opening requires entry. Sometimes restraint itself becomes the signal. The deeper issue sat inside the brand. If you value clear-eyed motorcycle coverage without hype, subscribe now. This channel follows the details others skip and the consequences that come later. Direction became unclear. Mixed signals fractured identity. Messaging pointed in multiple directions without resolution. The brand appeared uncertain whether it was reviving history or redefining it. That ambiguity weakened coherence. Clarity depends on alignment between intention and communication. Here, language suggested continuity, while execution suggested divergence. That mismatch created confusion. When direction blurs, interpretation replaces understanding. Different audiences reach different conclusions based on incomplete signals. This was not about product specifics. It was about narrative cohesion. A brand functions as a promise made repeatedly. When that promise becomes inconsistent, identity fragments. The Flying Flea did not create the confusion. It revealed it. Identity depends on consistent signals. When language diverges from direction, interpretation fills gaps, fragmenting perception. Over time, explanations multiply, confidence thins, and coherence weakens. This condition reflects internal misalignment, not isolated errors. Requiring clarity before credibility can recover fully again. Internal uncertainty manifests externally as mixed messaging. When alignment weakens, every statement requires explanation. Over time, explanations replace confidence. That shift changes how messages land, regardless of content. And confusion always carries a price. Reputation turned into risk. Trust loss produces measurable effects. Hesitation affects decisions. Resale confidence weakens. Long-term perception shifts. Reputation operates like currency. When it fluctuates, value follows. Riders began factoring uncertainty into decisions. Timing changed, commitments delayed. Confidence required verification rather than assumption. That behavior reflects risk management, not emotion. Reputation risk compounds slowly. Each hesitation reinforces the next. Over time, perception stabilizes at a lower baseline. Recovery becomes harder, not because of hostility, but because confidence requires rebuilding. Reputation influences valuation through behavior, not headlines. As confidence wavers, buyers delay and sellers adjust. These choices recalibrate. Markets gradually. Risk premiums rise quietly, embedding caution into forecasts and expectations until consistent evidence reverses the trend over sustained periods ahead. The Flying Flea shifted risk calculations. Trust became conditional. That condition affects future releases independent of merit. Reputation, once questioned, demands proof. This story doesn't end at one company. The industry paid attention. Across the industry, the response was quiet but deliberate. Other manufacturers watched the situation closely and adjusted behavior without announcement. Product timelines slowed. Internal reviews extended. Decisions that might once have been rushed were reconsidered. This was not reaction. It was defense, shaped by caution and memory. Defensive shifts appeared in subtle ways rather than public statements. Messaging tightened internally before it changed externally. Language became more careful, more exact, and less suggestive. Heritage references were paired with clearer boundaries about purpose and use. Where ambiguity once invited interpretation, clarity replaced suggestion. The goal was containment, not advantage. These changes were visible inside development cycles. Projects paused for reassessment. Processes were reviewed for alignment between promise and delivery. The emphasis moved toward verification instead of velocity. That shift did not create headlines, but it reduced exposure. This adjustment did not target a single competitor or moment. It reflected a shared understanding that credibility is fragile across the entire field. Manufacturers recognized that misalignment carries consequences beyond one release, affecting trust everywhere. Avoiding those consequences became a priority rooted in self-preservation. Parallel caution emerged independently across organizations, reflecting shared learning rather than coordination. Development slowed, reviews deepened, and language tightened. These measures aimed to preserve credibility by preventing misalignment, demonstrating how industry memory shapes present behavior without public declarations or announcements. That awareness spread without coordination. It emerged through parallel caution rather than shared instruction. Each manufacturer acted independently, yet outcomes aligned. The industry did not need consensus to recognize risk. Experience supplied that lesson. Recent history made the warning unmistakable to everyone watching because the issue goes deeper than competition. Craftsmanship still decides outcomes. Craftsmanship remains the deciding factor when presentation fades. Process determines outcome long before branding enters the picture. Skilled work, repeated consistently, produces reliability that no narrative can replace. Pride in execution shows itself quietly through precision and restraint. Manufacturing culture shapes results over time. When workers understand why standards exist, they uphold them without supervision. When processes are respected, variation narrows. That discipline creates continuity across shifts, batches, and years. It cannot be rushed or substituted. This principle holds regardless of era. Tools evolve, methods change, expectations adjust. Yet, the relationship between care and outcome remains fixed. Attention given early prevents correction later. Effort invested upstream reduces explanation downstream. Craftsmanship also depends on accountability. Clear ownership of work encourages responsibility. When responsibility diffuses, quality follows. Pride connects hands to results, making process visible even after the work is finished. Process excellence depends on habits reinforced daily. Skilled work thrives where standards are taught through example, not slogans. When pride anchors effort, variation narrows. Such cultures endure, producing reliability that outlasts campaigns, leadership cycles, and shifting market narratives over decades. Workplace habits form quietly. They are taught through example rather than instruction. When shortcuts become acceptable, they spread. When discipline is rewarded, it stabilizes. These cultural signals shape outcomes more powerfully than slogans or campaigns ever could. Over time, these patterns determine whether consistency improves or erodes across operations. Those results persist even when leadership changes, because habits outlast directives and promises. They define the real identity of any manufacturer over decades. Nothing replaces that foundation. It is permanent and unforgiving. Once lost, recovery is slow, and that ties directly to money. Trust is a financial asset. Trust operates like currency in long-term markets. It accumulates slowly and depletes quickly. When confidence weakens, buyers adjust behavior. Decisions slow. Commitments shorten. Risk tolerance declines. Hesitation becomes visible through patterns. Purchases are delayed. Alternatives are explored. Verification replaces assumption. These behaviors reflect calculation rather than emotion. Trust influences value by shaping willingness to engage. Reputation functions as a multiplier. Strong trust amplifies positives. Weak trust magnifies negatives. The same information produces different outcomes depending on baseline confidence. That effect persists across cycles. Financial impact emerges indirectly. Inventory moves differently. Pricing flexibility narrows. Forecasts incorporate caution. These adjustments appear subtle but compound over time, reshaping long-term value. Market behavior responds to perception more than intention. Once doubt enters valuation, it remains until offset by consistent proof. Short-term corrections rarely restore long-term confidence. Stability requires repetition without surprise. Over time, financial models adapt. Risk premiums rise. Expected returns adjust. Capital becomes selective. These shifts are rational responses to uncertainty rather than reactions to single events. Financial models internalize trust through adjusted assumptions. As uncertainty rises, capital demands proof and patience. This recalibration affects pricing, availability, and timing. Confidence restored only through consistency, aligning outcomes with promises across repeated cycles, observed without exception over time consistently. Confidence rebuilds only through alignment. Messaging must match outcome. Delivery must match promise. Until that alignment is observed repeatedly, caution dominates evaluation. That dynamic defines value beyond any single release. It influences decisions long after headlines fade. Markets remember patterns, not intentions. They price accordingly. Time confirms those adjustments without emotion or debate over time. Which brings the focus back where it belongs. What riders take from this? Awareness offers steadier footing than outrage. Reflection allows standards to remain intact. When emotion fades, understanding persists. That understanding empowers better decisions. Riders benefit from separating signal from noise. Not every release defines a brand. Not every misstep demands rejection. Discernment grows through observation rather than reaction. Experience teaches patience. Time reveals patterns more clearly than immediacy. By watching how issues are addressed, riders retain control over judgment. That control preserves independence. The lesson is simple. Attention matters. Awareness protects trust. By preventing assumption, standards remain personal and uncompromised. Long-term engagement depends on measured response. Riders who pause retain leverage. They decide when to commit and when to wait. That agency remains central to ownership. Information becomes useful only when placed in context. Isolated moments mislead, patterns inform. Awareness requires patience and comparison across time. Control does not come from certainty, it comes from adaptability. Riders who adjust expectations remain resilient. They protect their standards by refusing urgency. This approach avoids escalation. It favors learning over reaction. It keeps judgment intact. Over time, that steadiness compounds. Decisions feel grounded. Ownership remains deliberate rather than defensive. Discernment preserves agency. By observing patterns and resisting urgency, riders maintain control over decisions. Awareness reduces susceptibility to noise. This steadiness protects enjoyment, keeping focus on purpose rather than proof, and sustaining confidence through informed choice across years of riding. Perspective protects enjoyment. When pressure drops, riding returns to purpose rather than proof. That is where confidence belongs. With awareness steady, choices remain personal and informed. No noise required. Just clarity over time. That is enough. Nothing more. Nothing less either. At the end of the day, this was never just about one bike. It was about trust, and how quickly it thins when history is treated like a shortcut. Riders notice patterns. Now, I want to hear from you. Did you see this coming, or is it overblown? Drop your experience in the comments. If this helped, hit like and subscribe for straight talk that respects miles, not marketing.